Hey everybody, good to be with you today. Today we're talking about the Russian revolutions of 1917. Actually talking about two revolutions. We're talking about the February Revolution and the October Revolution. The February Revolution, that's the liberal revolution, where you get things like suffrage and freedom of speech, things like that we've seen in other revolutions. The October Revolution, that's the exciting one. That's the Communist Revolution that brings in people like Lenin and Trotsky and eventually Stalin. We call them the February and October revolutions, even though they happened in March and November, because the Russians were on a funny calendar at the time, and they wouldn't change to a calendar like the rest of the world has until a few years later. So we have to call them the February and October revolutions. So the reason for the revolution is World War I, right? Russia is getting pounded by the Germans. They are just not able to produce fast enough to make enough stuff to win this war, to even really fight the war very well. And so even though the Russian soldiers are tenacious and willing to fight and die for the Tsars, there's just not enough stuff to keep up with the Germans. And so we have soldiers being sent to the front without rifles, rifles with none of the bullets in them, starvation at home, soldiers without boots, using rags instead of shoes. There's just not enough stuff, and so it just seems like the soldiers are being sent to the front to die. And so people start looking for who to blame. And obviously the person in charge is the first person to try to blame. Now, before Nicholas goes to the front, a lot of blame falls to the generals, who, in addition to not having enough stuff, are sometimes pretty incompetent. But eventually, it's going to work its way up to the top. Right? Nicholas II is a really nice guy. He's a real family man, but he really doesn't have any interest in ruling. He's largely seen as incompetent by the people around him, including his own family, like his uncle, who was his father's brother, obviously. Really doesn't think he knows what he's doing. Doesn't think that Nicholas knows what he's doing. But at the same time, because he's Alexander III's son, he's super conservative, Nicholas II. And he thinks that God put him on the throne to protect the Russian people. Like, we're talking about a divine right monarchy. This guy is a divine rightist in 1917, right? The last time we talked about that was like Louis XVI, right? Which, there are a lot of similarities between this guy and Louis XVI. So unlike Louis XVI, Nicholas decides to go to the front to help fight a war. He does this to try to instill faith in the war effort from the Russian people. And the problem with this is a huge mistake, because now when the Russian army loses, he can't say it's the general's fault. The government can't pass the blame. It falls straight on Nicholas. And that's going to look terrible, because he has no idea what he's doing. And neither do his generals. They're going to lose this war. They just don't want to admit it. Similar to the Russo-Japanese War, really. The other reason that this is a huge problem is that he puts his wife in charge. Now, I have no problem with women being in charge, but his wife doesn't know what she's doing either. She's also been super concerned about her son, Alexei. Alexei was born with hemophilia, which means that when he gets a bruise or a cut, he could bleed to death. His blood doesn't clot like most people's does. And so just falling down and bumping his knee could kill him, because he could just bleed until he dies. And that's how she gets into a professional relationship with Rasputin. Rasputin is he's a holy man. He claims to be a holy man. So one day when Alexei falls and it looks like he's going to die and just keep bleeding, Alexandra calls Rasputin, and he says, "Don't worry, he's going to stop bleeding tomorrow," which he Alexei actually does. And so then Alexandra begins to listen to Rasputin as like an advisor. What she doesn't know is that he's just a terrible man. He's a womanizer, he's a drunkard, he's a gambler, he does terrible things to people. But she doesn't see that, because he makes sure not to do that around her. But she listens to him when it comes to running things in the government while the Tsar is gone. And so other people within the Russian government decide it's time to get rid of this guy. So they invite him to a dinner party where they feed him enough poison to kill like 5 men. And he just keeps laughing. He just keeps eating the poison. He's like, "Oh, this is like salt." So then they hit him really hard with a candlestick in the head, and they shoot him. At which point he gets up and decides it's probably time to leave. So he stumbles outside, where he's shot repeatedly, and again hit repeatedly with this candlestick. They take him and then they throw him into the river. And when the body is autopsied, they find that in fact there is water in his lungs, which means that he was still breathing when they threw him in the river. So I don't know what kind of guy this is, but I wouldn't want to mess with him, because he seems to be, he's out there. A lot of people are absolutely fascinated by Rasputin. Anyway, so within Russia, Petrograd, which is the capital, it used to be called St. Petersburg, but apparently that sounded too German when they started World War I, so they renamed it Petrograd. Petrograd is one of the more radical areas, and because it's the capital, it's the center of this radical uprising. The workers the workers within Petrograd are fed up, and so they spontaneously rise up to overthrow the Tsar. The Duma get out in front of it, and they get the Tsar to abdicate in their favor. He basically gives up power, and power goes to the Duma, which is the parliament that the Russians set up after the Russo-Japanese War. I see a lot of similarities between Petrograd and Paris during the French Revolution. The Parisians rose up. They, let's see, you got the fish ladies who walk to Versailles and get the king back into Paris, where he's able to basically do whatever the Parisians want. You got the sans-culottes. I see a lot of similarities between the sans-culottes of Paris and the workers of Petrograd. Basically, Paris and Petrograd are both hotbeds of radicalism in their respective revolutions. So after the February Revolution of 1917, where the liberal government and the socialist government comes to power, it's led by this guy down here, Alexander Kerensky. So Kerensky and the rest of the people in the Duma consider it their nationalistic duty to keep fighting the war, which is nuts, right? Because this is the war that led to the downfall of the Tsar. The reason they're in power is because the Tsar was losing this war, and then when they come to power, instead of just quitting the war, which probably would have led to them like stabilizing Russia and creating a government that lasted for years, they decide to keep fighting the war. And so the people keep undergoing the hardships that they were having to undergo before. The shortages are still there. The people are still dying. The soldiers are still dying. The generals are still incompetent. And as a result, it's not going to be long before the people are willing to listen to somebody else. So let's talk about that somebody else. Let's talk about Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. So Lenin is a communist, has been for years. But he spent and as a result, he spent most of his time outside of Russia. He did a 3-year stint in Siberia, and not purple lot, I mean like the real Siberia, like razor wire and like cold, and oh my gosh. And when he comes back, he goes to Switzerland, and the Russian government is happy to see him go. And so he keeps talking about communism in Russia while he lives in Switzerland. So Lenin's got 3 main ideas to his brand of communism. 1, violent revolution. There has to be violent revolution. He said revisionism is a half measure, very similar to Marx there. Number 2, Marx said you had to have a proletariat uprising. Proletariats are urban workers. Russia doesn't have many of those, and so Lenin says, look, we can use peasants, it'll be fine. So that's his second point. Number 3, and this really sets Leninism apart, is he says instead of having a spontaneous worker uprising like Marx predicted, let's have a small elite group of revolutionaries that purposefully bring about a revolution and then bring the workers on board after the revolution is secure. And so it's this small elite band of professional revolutionaries that really sets Lenin apart. But it's also one of the reasons that Lenin is successful, because when the people are upset and the people are ready to revolt, they have a small group of people who are ready to take charge and tell the people what to do, and to protect the revolution from the reactions of the government that they overthrow. So he moves back to Russia. The Germans let him move back to Russia. The Germans literally put him on a train from Switzerland and let him go through their lands all the way to Russia because they wanted him to start a revolution. So he gets to Russia and he starts a revolution because, yeah. And so the German plan there really worked out well. Really worked out well. He gets to Russia and he promises the three things that people want: peace, bread, and land. We're going to end the war, we're going to feed the people, and we're going to split up the land that belongs to the rich people and give it to the peasants. This is what everybody wanted. This is what the provisional government should have done. But they didn't because, I don't know. I don't know why. I really don't. Nationalism, maybe? Anyway, Lenin's second in command is this guy Trotsky. Leon Trotsky is a brilliant administrator. He's an amazing organizer, and he really gets the job done. He becomes a member of the Petrograd Soviet, and he gets this Petrograd Soviet, which is the Petrograd City Council, to create a military wing and make him the leader, which is great because then he basically has an army that belongs to him inside the capital. So then he uses it. In October/November of 1917, he and the Petrograd Soviet military wing rush into government buildings, rush into the Duma, say the Duma is abolished, say that the government now belongs to them, and it does. And so they basically manage to orchestrate a simultaneous takeover of so many places that they basically do become the leaders of Russia. And so they systematically begin to consolidate power. Number one, we got to get rid of the war. So they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This is a huge, huge loss. Germany says you have to give up all this land in red. And at first Lenin says, you've got to be kidding me. And the German army then just begins to advance. And Lenin realizes that if he doesn't sign this treaty, then the Germans are just going to march all the way to Moscow, and the revolution is going to be over. So he signs the treaty. Peace comes to Russia. The war is over after millions and millions of lives were lost. We'll get to that tomorrow. Number two, now we got to fight. So now he brings about peace just in time to fight the Russian Civil War. So the Russian Civil War has got two sides. You got the whites, who are the anti-communists, and the reds, who are the communists. And the Red Army is consolidated here in the middle, and they occupy in the industrial center. They occupy Moscow, they occupy Saratov, they occupy Petrograd, they occupy the center of Russia. On the outside, you've got about 12 to 20 different groups who are considered the whites. They don't really like each other, but they all agree that they really, really don't like the communists. So usually I would say that if you're surrounded, you're really in a bad position. But the Reds, because they're surrounded, because they're consolidated, they're able to act with more unity than the whites. The whites attack somewhat sporadically. They don't really talk with each other. And as a result, the Reds are able to isolate and defeat each of the different white armies that surround them. And so the Reds end up winning the Russian Civil War, and the communists begin to consolidate power. And one of the first things they do is they use that Red Army that just finished the Civil War to march into Ukraine and Belarus and reoccupy them in spite of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Why would the Red Army, that's supposedly an anti-imperial army, reconquer Ukraine and Belarus? One of the hallmarks of Russian communism and communism in general is the desire to spread communism. And if that has to happen country by country, then so be it. If that has to happen through occupation and convincing the people once you're there that communism is what they want, then so be it. And so you're going to see this over and over, where this anti-imperial rhetoric is coming out of the Soviet Union, while at the same time the Red Army is marching in and taking over places like Poland, which is back for a limited time, but not for long. And so they're always out to try to spread communism to other places. Right. So that brings an end, I think, to today's talk, right? Yeah. So hopefully you saw the other video on NTI days. If you have any questions about the Russian Revolution of 1917, post it in comments, send it to me on Remind, email me, and I'll be in your feed again tomorrow with more information. And if you have any questions, let me know. Be flexible, stay safe, wash your hands. We'll see you guys soon.